I am back for more in a slightly different location, so there might be some background noise and some echoing, but here is Part 6, Chapter 3. 1/3 of the sentence had been served. Throughout the day and into the night, the southwesterly wind continued, growing ever stronger. By the time the bleak gray sky grew light on the morning of April 30th, the surface of the sea was torn into foam, and the frenzied screech of the gale through the rigging rose and fell hysterically as the carriage was lifted to each successive swell. The temperature had dropped very close to zero, and the bitterness of the wind suggested that it was blowing straight off pack ice that was not very far away. As the morning hours passed, it became more and more of a struggle to steer the boat. The 60-knot gale drove her head down into the seas, and the huge waves that rolled up astern constantly threatened to slew her around broadside. By mid-morning, she was wallowing more than sailing, running off to one side and then the other, and taking seas on board with almost every wave. The pump was not adequate to handle the water, and extra hands had to be called to bail. Toward noon, the boat began to ice up. The decision was inevitable, but Shackleton put it off as long as he dared. They pumped and bailed and beat the ice off her, all the while fighting to hold her stern up into the wind. Noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, but it was no use. The sea was more than she could take. Shackleton reluctantly gave the order to come about. The sails were dropped, and the sea anchor, a cone-shaped piece of canvas about 4 feet long, was put over on the end of a long bow line. It dragged through the water and thus brought the carriage's bow up into the wind. Almost at once, conditions improved. At least less water came on board. The boat, however, behaved like a thing possessed. She staggered drunkenly upward over each new wave, then plunged sideways only to have her bow jerked violently around as she seized up on the sea anchor. There was never a moment, not even an instant of repose. The only thing to do was to hang on and endure. It was not long before the furled sails started to collect ice, and with each burst of spray, their load grew heavier. Within an hour, they were frozen into a solid mass, and the action of the boat was growing sluggish as she began to get top-heavy. The sails had to be removed, so Crean and McCarthy were sent forward, and after knocking off the ice, they brought the sails below and stuffed them into the already crammed space under the decking. But then a heavy coating began to accumulate on the oars. There were 4 of them lashed against the shrouds. As the ice built up, they became like miniature bulwarks, which prevented the water from spilling overboard before it froze. Shackleton watched anxiously, hoping that load of ice on deck might not grow too heavy, but in the failing light of dusk, he saw that it would be dangerous to let it go until morning. He ordered Worsley, Crean, and McCarthy to go with him up onto the pitching deck. With great effort, they clubbed the ice off the oars, then pitched 2 of them over the side. The remaining pair was lashed to the shrouds about 18 inches above the deck so that the water would run off. It took more than 20 minutes, and by the time they were finished, it was dark, and they were utterly drenched. They crept back into the cockpit, and the night began. Each of the waves shivered through their 4 hideous hours, cringing beneath the decking, sodden and half-frozen, trying to remain upright against the wild lurching of the boat while perched on the despised rocks in the bottom. For 7 painful days, the rocks had made eating difficult. They had interfered with bailing, they had vastly complicated the simple act of getting about, and they had made sleeping all but impossible. But it was moving them that was worst of all. Periodically, they had to be shifted in order to ballast the boat properly, which meant lifting them while crouched over and kneeling, often painfully, on other rocks. By now, every sharp corner and every slippery surface was intimately known and utterly detested. Then, too, there were the reindeer hairs. They molted from the insides of the sleeping bags, and at first they had been only a petty annoyance, but no matter how much hair was shed, the supply seemed inexhaustible. They were everywhere, the sides of the boat, the seats, the ballast. They clung in wet clumps to faces and hands. The men breathed them as they slept, and occasionally woke up choking on them. The hairs ran down into the bottom and clogged the pump, and little clusters of them were turning up more and more frequently in the food. Gradually, as the long hours of the night crept by, a subtle change could be detected in the boat. For one thing, the trickles of water through the decking became smaller, then finally ceased altogether. At the same time, her behavior was growing noticeably less violent, and instead of pitching wildly, she rose to the seas with increasing restraint. The first light of dawn told why. The entire boat above the waterline was encased in ice, half a foot thick in places, and the rope to the sea anchor had grown to the size of a man's thigh. Under the weight of it, she was riding at least 4 inches deeper, like a waterlogged derelict rather than a boat. Worsley was on watch, and he immediately sent McCarthy to awaken Shackleton, who hurried aft. When he saw the situation, he excitedly ordered all hands called. Then he himself took a small axe and cautiously crawled forward. With extreme care so as to not puncture the decking, he began to knock the ice away with the backside of the axe. Periodically, a wave burst against the boat and swept over him, but he kept at it for nearly 10 minutes while the others anxiously looked on. By then he was so stiff with cold that he could no longer trust his grip or balance. He crawled back into the cockpit with the water dripping from his clothes and beard frozen half stiff. He was shivering noticeably as he handed the axe to Worsley to continue the job, cautioning him to use extreme care while he was on the decking. And so each of them took his turn for chipping for as long as he could endure it, which was really more than 5 minutes. First, they had to knock off enough ice to get a handhold and a place to put their knees. To stand up on that glassy, rolling deck would have been to commit suicide, for had a man fallen overboard, the others could never have gotten the sea anchor and hoisted sail in time to rescue him. Below, Shackleton discovered that the ice was forming even inside the cockpit. Long icicles hung from under the decking, and the water in the bottom was very nearly frozen. He called for Crean, and together they managed to get the Primus stove alight, in the hope that it would give off enough heat to warm the cockpit above the freezing point. Unless the water in the bottom could be thawed enough so it could be pumped out, there was danger that it would simply sink the boat under them. It took an hour of agonizing work on deck before they felt the Caird begin to regain her buoyancy, but they kept at it until they had succeeded in getting rid of most of the ice, except a large chunk on the sea anchor line, which they simply could not risk attempting to reach. Shackleton then called them below to have some milk. They gathered around the stove, almost sick with cold. It seemed inconceivable that their numbed bodies could have given off any warmth, but apparently they did, for after a while the icicles under the decking began to melt and drip down onto them. Not long afterward, the water in the bottom had thawed enough so that they could pump it out. Shackleton still had Crean keep the Primus stove alight, but toward noon, the acrid fumes it gave off had made their air almost unbreathable, and it had to be extinguished. It took several minutes for the atmosphere to clear, and then they became aware of a new smell, a fetid, sweet-sour sort of odor, like spoiled meat. McNeish discovered it from the sleeping bags, which in fact had begun to rot. A closer examination disclosed that 2 of them actually were slimy inside. Throughout the afternoon, the coating of ice steadily built up again, and late in the day, Shackleton decided there was too much at stake to gamble on the chance that the Caird would survive until morning. Once more, he ordered that the boat be cleared. It took more than an hour, but finally it was done, and after a ration of hot milk, they settled down to wait for morning. The southwesterly gale screamed on, showing not the slightest sign of fatigue. The watches of that night were like a tally sheet of infinity. Every individual minute had to be noted, then lived through, and finally checked off. There was not even a crisis to relieve the tortured monotony. When at last, about 6 o'clock, the sky to the east began to brighten, they could see that once again the boat was carrying a dangerously heavy burden of ice. As soon as the light was permitted, she had to be chipped clear for the 3rd time. It was May 2nd, and the beginning of the 3rd day of the gale. The weather throughout had been overcast, so that no position could be obtained. Now the anxiety of not knowing where they were was added to everything else. Some time after 9 o'clock, the wind eased ever so slightly, though nowhere near enough to get underway. A few minutes later, the Caird rose to a particularly high sea, and just then she was struck by a breaking wave. The smallest quiver, a gentle shock, passed through her, and the wave rolled on. By this time, she didn't swing back up into the wind. The sea anchor was gone.